This ant has stronger venom than a rattlesnake. And that's not even the craziest thing about it. The extreme challenges of survival in Florida's untamed wilderness have pushed the Florida harvester ant to evolve one of the most potent toxins in the US. But the true secret to their incredible success may be something even more powerful than venom. An unbreakable bond at the heart of one of nature's most dominant societies. Humans like to think that we have the world's most complex societies, the strongest social groups. But nature has a funny way of reminding us that we're not always on top, and ants prove exactly why. It's estimated that there are over 20 quadrillion ants on Earth. That's 20 followed by 15 zeros, which means there's about 2.5 million ants for every one human on the planet. And that's just a conservative estimate. With such a mind-blowingly large population, it's really no wonder why ants are the foundation of countless ecosystems across the globe, and arguably the most successful group of insects on Earth. On every continent except Antarctica, in basically any terrestrial habitat, ants can be found diligently working to support themselves and their colony. And deep in the rugged scrubs of Florida, there's one ant species whose toxic power stands above the rest. My name is Evan, and this is Harrison. We're twin brothers on a mission to make you an insider in the natural world. And today, we're investigating how the unassuming Florida harvester ant survives in one of the harshest ecosystems in the United States, the Florida scrub, to answer an important question. Are these highly venomous ants dangerous to people? We're exploring this unique habitat alongside our good friend and fellow bug nerd Spencer Hoffman in search of some of its rarer denizens. But almost immediately after arriving on location, we quite literally walked right into an encounter with these insanely toxic insects.
Today, we are exploring a fairly small and pretty urban park here in Central Florida because there are a number of very, very special invertebrates found here. Our big target is the red widow spider, but actually, literally, on the walking trail is the nest of Paganomyrmex thaddeus, the Florida harvester ant. The single most venomous insect, not only in all of Florida, not only all of the East Coast, but one of the top 3, probably, right, Spencer? Mm-hmm. Top 3 most venomous insects in the United States. Literally not scripted, by the way. They're in the path. I bet you didn't realize that the most venomous species of insect on the East Coast of the United States is a tiny little ant. But that is actually just scratching the surface of what makes these animals so fascinating. And actually, this is a species that Evan and I have wanted to show you for many years, because the Florida harvester ant is one of the coolest insects out here. Here in Florida, the scrub habitats that these ants live in are incredibly biodiverse, which means that these ants deal with a ton of competition and a lot of predators as well, which is why they've evolved such a toxic venom. Scientifically, venom toxicity is measured with something called an LD50, which essentially means the lethal dose of venom required to kill a percentage of your test subjects. And in the case of the Florida harvester ant, their venom has been measured at 0.42 milligrams per kilogram. And to put that into context, the western diamondback rattlesnake, the species of snake responsible for more snakebite deaths than any other snake in the country, has an LD50 of 2.2. So that may give you a bit of an idea of how deadly the venom of this ant is. Now, of course, each individual ant only has a tiny amount of venom, but if you were to take dozens or even hundreds of stings, which is entirely possible if you were to agitate a colony, that could actually be pretty serious. Absolutely. Now, luckily, Florida harvester ants are not known to be aggressive in any way towards people, but one of the primary functions of their venom is for defense. The toxicity is enough that it can deter almost any kind of vertebrate predator, even particularly large lizards or birds, because venom that toxic is also extremely painful when it enters the body because it's a neurotoxin. It attacks the nervous system of whatever they sting and tells them that they're experiencing a ton of pain, and is usually enough to drive off any potential predator.
These tiny toxic titans punch way above their weight class in terms of venom potency, but what really makes their venom such a useful defensive tool isn't how it works, but who it works on. See, harvester ants use their sting almost exclusively for defense, so their venom is specialized to be super effective against their main predators, vertebrates, and humans are no exception. To find out if these ants are really something people need to worry about, we tested their stings in the field.
The pain is obviously minimal just because of how little venom was actually injected, but given the size of this ant, that is a very impressive sting. That is the most potent insect venom in all of Florida in my arm, and I feel next to nothing at all.
Now, of course, the dosage makes the poison, so even the most venomous insect on the East Coast can't deliver enough venom to seriously harm a human with a single sting. But I have to say, the effects are pretty impressive. The venom causes nerve cells around the sting site to overfire, sending constant signals through the nervous system that trigger intense and long-lasting pain. But while the venom is powerful, its chemical composition is actually pretty basic. It's mostly made up of simple molecules called peptides, plus a small amount of other proteins, and this relatively simple recipe comes with a major trade-off. By specializing its function on vertebrates, the venom became much less effective against invertebrates, and the effects aren't even close. The lethal dose of 0.42 milligrams per kilogram that we mentioned earlier only applies to vertebrates, and when the venom was tested on invert nervous systems, the LD50 was found to be 103 milligrams per kilogram. So amazingly, the same venom that could easily put down a lizard or a rat would have very little effect on a much smaller animal like a beetle or a grasshopper. But even wielding one of the country's strongest venoms isn't enough to explain the Florida harvester ant's success, because there's a lot more to life in the scrub than just defending against predators.
Now, these ants will also eat a variety of vegetation, and that's actually why they're called harvester ants, because you'll see them take all kinds of seeds and leaves and other bits of vegetation that they'll drag back to the colony and form what are called granaries, which are subsections of the nest where they're storing all of their food. Now, these chambers will be situated sometimes 100 centimeters down under the ground, but that is barely scratching the surface of how big the nests will actually be, because a large Florida harvester ant nest can be 2.5 or 3 meters deep. That's over 9 feet. So these tiny ants are excavating massive, basically underground cities that can be home to thousands upon thousands of individual ants, all coming from a single queen. The social structure of Florida harvester ant colonies is actually incredibly complex, and one of the things I find absolutely fascinating about this species is how much variation there is between the different castes of ant workers. Now, the smallest of the workers will be about 6 millimeters in length, so that's absolutely tiny, but the largest of the majors will get to be about 10 to 12 millimeters, which is about as big as the queen herself. So there is a huge amount of variation in size and shape for the workers. The way the colony is structured is actually divided by age. So the youngest ants actually hang out way at the bottom of the nest, so they'll be taking care of the eggs and the queen and doing a lot of the tasks that aren't as dangerous to the workers. As they age, they start to take on more complex and more dangerous tasks higher and higher up in the nest. So the mid-sized workers are going to be tending to the granaries and bringing food down to feed the queen, and then the oldest, most experienced ants are the ones who get the tough jobs. They have to defend the colony and go out and harvest food, which is where the vast majority of ants are being picked off by predators. So it's fascinating that it's not only a size thing, but also an age and experience equation that determines when the ants will be doing the most difficult and arduous tasks. I just jumped behind the camera, but this is pretty dope. So actually what these ants appear to be doing is excavating this burrow. We're seeing a number of individuals crawling out from this entrance here. There's one right now actually with just a little small piece of sand that it deposited around the outside. And it's interesting because this species is actually known to relocate their nests at least once per year, and they'll move it usually only a couple meters, but it's along an established foraging trail that these ants will follow. So it usually only takes them a few days to build a new burrow. And Spencer, how many ants would be in there? Because you've seen these before.
It depends on the size and the age of the colony. It could be a few hundred, it could be a few thousand. These particular individuals are actually kind of small for Badius, so I would imagine this might be a younger colony. So it could be a bit smaller than like a really established one. These are little dudes, so they're probably a lot younger.
Now we'll get more into their morphology in a little bit, but what's fascinating about this species is that they're the only harvester ant in all of North America to display polymorphism, or differences in the size and even shape of their bodies between different classes of ants. So their social structure is actually extremely complex. There is a ton of labor that goes into creating a successful ant colony, and one thing is clear. A super toxic venom alone isn't enough to get these jobs done. The venom is useful for solving some problems like defense, but it can't help them get food, build shelter, or reproduce. So clearly there has to be more going on here. But to get to the bottom of how these ants survive so well, we need to find a larger, more mature colony with all of the worker castes represented to understand the whole story of their success.
Now, this big patch of open sand looks like the last place any animal would want to live, especially a tiny little insect. But this is actually the exact microhabitat preference of the ant species we're looking for. Florida harvester ants are some of the most heat-tolerant and xeric-adapted species that you can find in this entire ecosystem. So the best way to look for them is to try and find their characteristic mound that they will build right in these open habitats. And not only do they like these exposed open areas, they're most active at the peak heat of the day. That's why most of the harvester ants in the country actually live out in the deserts of the West. Here, in these Florida scrub habitats, is the only place on the East Coast where you will see a harvester ant. So this is exactly where we want to be, believe it or not. But it's not easy going for us.
We might think we have it bad, but the Florida scrub is a really tough place to live if you're an insect. The intense heat and arid sandy soil make it more like a desert than the wetlands the state is known for. But this is Florida we're talking about, so the scrub gets hit with a lot of extreme weather too. Local wildlife has to contend with drought and wildfires at some times of year and hurricanes and heavy flooding at others. But despite this, there are thousands of invertebrates who have figured out how to survive here. The harvester ants have to compete with dozens of other ant species while also dealing with the unforgiving climate. But what's interesting is, these things are actually why they build their nests in such inhospitable parts of the habitat. They choose exposed sandy spots because they drain well when it rains, and they usually have fewer plant roots that would get in the way of excavating the nest. Also, these sun-baked areas are too hot for many other diurnal ants to handle. But Florida harvesters can manage just fine thanks to their amazing thermal tolerance, which allows their bodies to function normally in temperatures as high as 50 degrees Celsius. That's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The thing is, ants are so tiny that they actually can't regulate their own body temperature. So they need some heat to give themselves energy, but too much could quickly kill them. Believe it or not, their nest placement is actually an ingenious solution to this challenge, because exposing it to the sun heats the nest enough to warm all the ants working in the colony without them needing to come to the surface, and also supports the development of the larvae, which need a lot of heat and energy to grow. All of these adaptations have made Florida harvester ants one of the most successful species in the scrub, and because of that, it didn't take long for Spencer to find our target. An older harvester ant colony with majors.
Oh, there we go. Spencer just spotted exactly what we're hoping to see.
Just follow the workers that are holding stuff.
Right.
Find the nest.
I'm gonna get this little guy, who seems to know what's going on here, into this container. There we go. All right,
So what we have right here are actually two different ants from this colony. We have a minor worker and a major worker side by side, because we really want to show you just how different their morphology really is.
Now, the biggest difference between a major and a minor is the head size. That's how we can tell, even from a distance, that we have a major, because their head is so comically large, which they use primarily for dismantling the prey that they catch, but it doesn't hurt in a defensive scenario either. But what I find really fascinating is even though they look totally different and they're likely different ages as well, these ants only have one queen, so all of the workers are siblings. More than that, they're literally clones, so we relate.
Yeah.
It might seem obvious that the ants in a colony are related to each other, but the fact that they're all literally sisters surprises a lot of people. They're not true clones per se. The queen uses genetic material from multiple different males to produce her offspring during the year, but female ants in a colony share about 75% of their genes. That's more than humans share with their siblings. Many kinds of animals live in groups with their relatives, but they usually share one major stressor: reproduction. In mammals, birds, fish, and even many invertebrates, living in social groups is a delicate balance of supporting each other through challenges like avoiding predators and finding food, while still securing the right to breed. However, that's not a problem here, because in a colony of harvester ants, only the queen can reproduce. Ants are what is known as eusocial, meaning that there is typically only one reproductive individual, and everyone else in the colony exists to serve the needs of that central figure. Without the pressure to reproduce on their own, ants can cooperate in ways that are far more complex than almost any other animal, and at their size, that is critical for their survival.
There are a lot of very complex social organizations in nature, but ants take this social ecology to an entirely new level.
You have to figure that these are tiny animals, so even though a single individual is perfectly capable of carrying out its assigned tasks, there's just no way they'd be able to provide enough food and create the shelter they need to survive all by themselves. They really require the entire colony to work together to provide the resources they need to survive, because if a single individual were to get separated from the group, they would maybe only last a day or two out here before their resources would run out.
And that ecological challenge is what has given rise to one of the most fascinating social structures in the animal world, a concept that in biology is referred to as the superorganism. So you can think about it like this. In a flock of birds or a school of fish, let's say, those animals are working cooperatively to achieve bigger goals, but each individual bird or fish has its own things to contend with. It has the food that it needs to eat, avoiding predators. Those are sort of individual activities for those animals, and they just rely on each other for certain benefits, like having a lower risk of being eaten when a predator is around, but they're still operating independently. But as Evan pointed out, ants are so small that they actually require the unique tasks that the different castes carry out in order to survive. And that is the basis of the superorganism idea. All of the individuals collectively sort of form the activities of one larger organism, which then makes the organism itself, the colony as a whole. Now, the way they actually organize these tasks is an entirely different rabbit hole that is just as fascinating, and that all comes down to the queen.
Nothing works without the queen in an ant colony. The colony needs different kinds of work done depending on its age and what season it is, so the queen can control whether she produces minor or major workers by feeding developing larvae different amounts of food. The more protein a larva receives and the more often it's fed, the larger its caste will be when it matures, so the larvae that get fed the most become the majors. The queen can also control specific gene expression in her offspring to guide their development, but how she's able to do this is not well understood. This may seem like a lot of extra effort, but being able to have multiple unique castes to handle different challenges at the same time makes the colony a lot more efficient and successful in the long run. Now, to organize all this labor, ants use a complex series of chemical pheromones to communicate what's happening in the colony and get help where it's needed. There are trail pheromones that lead workers to a cache of food or an ongoing task that needs reinforcements, recruitment pheromones that direct them to assist with that job, alarm pheromones that warn the colony of an attack or predator, and even sex pheromones that indicate that the queen is ready to mate, among many others. These chemical signals are the language of the ant colony, far more useful to them than sight or sound, and they allow the harvester ant superorganism to accomplish some unbelievable things.
Each individual ant, rather than acting as its own distinct organism, they sort of function like the cells of this superorganism.
And you can think about each caste of ants as sort of functioning like an organ within that larger superorganism. So for example, the ants way at the base of the nest that are taking care of the queen, tending to the eggs, feeding the larvae, those are kind of like the digestive tract of the superorganism. They're the ones providing the food in the necessary places to keep the organism running. And then moving up in the nest, you have the workers that are tending to the granaries, and those are kind of like the stomach of the superorganism. They're the ones that are processing the food that the entire colony relies on to get their nutrients.
Now you can think of the major workers like the hands of the organism. They're the ones who are breaking down the food, defending the colony when they have to, but they have that sort of multi-purpose role, just like our hands do, that makes them an integral part of the colony. So each of the different age classes of ants and the castes themselves are serving unique functions that each differ from each other. So the colony can't survive without many majors, many workers, many smaller workers at different levels of the colony. They all have to be present in order for the colony to keep growing. And that's actually what the queen does. Not only does she sort of act as the reproductive organ of the colony, but she's also like the brain, because it's her organization and direction that assigns all the tasks to the ants and gives them their function.
And the amazing thing about the superorganism is that it allows the ants to achieve so much more than they ever could on their own. Not only are they able to support a flourishing society with thousands upon thousands of individuals, they also have a much greater impact on the ecosystem than they ever could on their own or even in just a small group. They're able to collect pounds of food to supply energy for the colony. They're able to excavate tunnels that run meters under the soil in just a few days. So by working cooperatively in such a coordinated manner, it allows them to increase their power exponentially and achieve incredible feats for such tiny animals.
Practically no other animals can unify and work together as well as ants can, and that is what has made these tiny insects into one of the most dominant forces in the natural world. They now live on almost every inhabited landmass on Earth, and with well over 15,000 species known to science and hundreds found in Florida alone, there is no shortage of incredible ant stories to talk about in future videos. We have plans to feature a lot more insects here on the channel, so if that's something that you'd like to see, let us know in the comments. Now, the Florida harvester ant's insanely toxic venom is fascinating to us and is what drew us to tell their story. But potent as it may be, there are much more powerful and terrifying stings out there. We recently traveled to Ecuador to track down the most infamous ant on the planet, the bullet ant, and answer one burning question. Do they really have the most painful insect sting on Earth? There's only one way to find out. And if you want to learn the truth about the bullet ant and see what you might get wrong about them, check out this video, where we put the so-called King of Sting to the ultimate test. And with that, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one.
That's why me and Rodney started Nature Walk, to show.
That's why me and Rodney started Nature Walk, so everyone can know how neat nature is, instead of just me and Rodney knowing it.